Hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Carey. I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to wish you all a healthy and certainly more peaceful new year. As we kick off our 2024 programming in the midst of a surge in conflict in the region with a horrific death toll in Gaza and a war that risks spreading even further throughout the region, we thought we'd put forward our entire brain trust in order to help our audience better understand regional developments and highlight some trends that we'll be watching closely this year. Because we have quite a large group of speakers, I'll forego introductions and just mention the folks speaking today, starting with Hussein Ibish, Kristen Smith-Diwan, Robert Mogilnicki, all senior resident scholars at AGSIW, in addition to visiting fellow Tim Callan, visiting scholar Eleanor Vendenbosch, senior fellow Ali Alfone, and our president, Ambassador Douglas Silliman, and our executive vice president, Ambassador Bill Roebuck. Each speaker will take about 5 minutes to say a few words, and then we'll open the session up for Q&A. We'll begin with Hussein Ibish, who will start us off with a regional overview. So Hussein, please, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. What I think I'm going to be looking at in the coming year and what is happening right now is the crisis facing U.S. policies in the Middle East, which affect very greatly relations with Gulf Arab countries. And the reality at the moment is that the policy of the Biden administration in the region is in virtually total collapse on all directions. It's under attack from friend and foe alike. Allies and adversaries are both contributing to the utter breakdown of the Biden administration's pre-existing Middle East policy. I say pre-existing, I mean before the Hamas-led attack on southern Israel of October 7, which has thrown the region into chaos. The existing policy of the Biden administration, which was a wise and sensible one, was to promote stability, security, and especially regional integration, both through expanded diplomatic relations, including Israel, and generalized reconciliation, and even infrastructural integration, which is sort of important to incentivizing moderation and disincentivizing, if that's a word, violence and confrontation and what have you. And it was going quite well, even to the point where what had been a sort of assumed to be a fanciful idea of a triangular agreement between the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia looked like it was a very plausible arrangement. The big question was whether the Israelis would be willing to compromise. But I think the U.S. and Saudi Arabia came incredibly close to bridging all the differences that they had on that agreement. And the whole thing has been thrown into disarray because of this Hamas attack. What we've seen, first of all, in the region that affects the United States in particular, is the relatively cautious but no doubt powerful deployment of Iran's network of armed gangs and militias in the region, led by Hezbollah. But one of the key factors that has emerged in this conflict is the new role of the Houthis in Yemen, which is a new threat that has to be dealt with by the administration. It's very directly a challenge to the United States because, as I've argued, the American interest in the region, which has traditionally been conceptualized as oil and Israel, actually has changed much more in terms of great power competition with China into stability and control over the maritime waters around the Arabian Peninsula, the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Suez Canal, through which so much global shipping, Chinese imports of energy, Chinese exports of goods and manufactured items flow. 12% of global commerce goes through Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal. That's an extraordinary number. And the Houthi threat to shipping is one that is going to have to be met by the United States. It's going to be very difficult to police the Red Sea with, just naval flotillas. It may well, if the Houthis don't back down, the U.S. is going to have to seriously consider getting involved in violence against the Houthis directly. It's going to be very hard to avoid that if they persist. And it's noteworthy that once again, Iran is sort of indirectly making the point that if it's not included in in maritime security arrangements, including in the Red Sea, which is far flung, but also, of course, in the Gulf region and the Arabian Sea, then there won't be one. And that if Iran can't sell its oil because of sanctions, nobody can buy and sell without fear of molestation. So this is very important. You've seen also more attacks with the Iraqi based militants, and the U.S. killed a major Iranian commander in Syria. I'm sure my colleagues will talk about that. But all of this is a show of strength by the so-called axis of resistance, right? Iran essentially getting Arabs to fight its war for them. And I think that's a fair way of putting it. But there's a great deal of demonstration of the strength and cohesion of that network, now led more by Nasrallah than anybody else after the killing of Qasem Soleimani. The big exception is Hezbollah, which has shown a great deal of restraint since October 7. And in fact, in that front, which is the one that the administration was most concerned about, and I should point out that the main policy of the Biden administration after the October 7 attacks was to prevent the conflict from spreading beyond Gaza. It only shifted to restraining the Israelis in Gaza after the first 4 weeks when it didn't spread. And it didn't spread because none of the parties that could make it spread, Iran, the United States, Israel, and Hezbollah, wanted it to spread. But it looks like that has increasingly changed as the faction within Israel's war cabinet that actively wants a war with Hezbollah in order to degrade the capabilities of its most potent immediate enemy, and also potentially to set in motion a cascade of events that could produce a U.S. attack against Iran and its nuclear facilities that Israel has been asking for 2 decades and hasn't gotten. What's remarkable is that it is now Israel which is escalating and using brinksmanship on the Lebanese front, demanding that Hezbollah remove its forces to the Litani River, consistent with UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was adopted in 2006. But it's rather rich to see the Israelis demanding the enforcement of UN Security Council resolutions, because I don't think there's any country which has ignored more of them for a longer period of time than Israel. However, all of this is a pretext, as is the idea that this war is necessary, this potential war with Hezbollah is necessary to protect the 80,000 Israeli civilians who have been evacuated. That situation did not exist when these people first started agitating for an attack on Hezbollah back on October 10th and 11th. So you've got the United States policies therefore squeezed between friend and foe alike, being challenged by Iran's network and Hamas on the one hand, and also by Israel with its escalatory zeal on the other. This has all contributed to the crisis of confidence in the U.S. among Gulf states. It looks like the U.S. has lost control of its policy, of its allies, of its adversaries, that events are spiraling out of control of the United States. There's also a potential big problem with Qatar, which we can get into because of its relationship with Hamas. But the Gulf states are still looking for security guarantees and developing their individual ties with Iran. But there is, again, there's this sort of crisis of confidence in the United States. But I just wanted to say, having been kind of Debbie Downer so far, there's a huge opportunity here for Washington. As with the Ukraine invasion, which created havoc in Europe for a while, there's a chance that this chaos could become the key to a resurgence of U.S. leadership and credibility, but it has to be managed wisely and effectively to push back against foes and friends. So the Houthi challenge is a particularly strong one. The United States is really going to have to take the lead in pushing back on that and not listening to those who want to avoid that conflict. It is necessary to restrain the Houthis if they don't back down. But it is also necessary that Israel must be made to see that it benefits more from a strong regional network led by Washington than a traumatized rampage of smashing potential foes, left, right, and center. It's going to be hard. And I just close by noting that before October 7, as the potential triangular deal with Saudi Arabia was going forward, it was Israel that was the biggest problem, because the United States did not make progress on getting Israel to be forthcoming on the Palestinian issue. So in terms of situations of war and peace, Israeli extremism, the extremism of the current Israeli government, has been a big challenge for Washington that Washington has not faced. Washington has pretended it doesn't exist, but now it can't be ignored. And so getting control of allies as well as adversaries is going to be a key to the potential U.S. success if it can manage this crisis in the coming year or two. I think there's a good chance Washington could be successful, but it is going to require some very tough decisions. All right, I'm going to stop there.
Great, thank you, Hussein. I'd like to bring in Kristen Smith-Diwan, another one of our senior resident scholars, to tell us more about how the Gulf states are navigating this difficult period and what else to look forward to this year, Kristen, that you're focusing on.
Yeah, thanks, Raymond. Yeah, I'm really struck listening to the incredibly dire situation in Gaza and regional situation that Hussein has just described. How much that is in conflict with the tenor and the plans of the Gulf states, which is where I'm going to be putting a lot of my focus this year. Because we look at the Gulf states, they've really, while they've all reoriented their domestic politics to focus much more on this kind of nationalism, a real focus on national interests, all of that is premised on a posture that's really seeking greater global integration and the sort of new network sort of economy that requires much more stability in the region, and also much more outreach to a number of different partners, and outreach in a way that is done through different means than they have in the past. And a lot of my work will be looking at those new means this year. A lot of this is really premised on the changes that have happened in the other countries before, but most notably in Saudi Arabia, obviously, which is just a huge transformation that everyone is dealing with. Working into a lot of new areas. The diversification of the economy has entailed a completely restructuring of the society and the politics too, to allow for outreach in these new areas, whether they be in technology, in tourism, very notably, also in arts and entertainment, and in sports. And if you look at all of these, this allows Saudi Arabia and indeed all the other Gulf states to build relations with other states through these new kinds of partnerships that just weren't even available to them previously. So AGSIW will be looking at this a lot. We have some renewed strength in the cultural area through a new cultural associate we have, Nada Amagwi. We now have a new publication called the Culture Column that pulls together all of these different initiatives that we see and happenings in the Gulf. I hope that you'll all take a look at that. We're also doing that through a new Instagram feed that allows us to track a lot of these, all of the activities of AGSIW, but in particular these new outcomes in technology, arts and entertainment. We're also doing this through new partnerships. AGSIW will be participating in the Cultural Summit in Abu Dhabi in March, where we're working with a number of Gulf artists to display their work and some of their initiatives. And we have other partnerships, such as with Huna in the Gulf, that allow us to look at art. We're also going to be looking at sports, or I will be very concretely looking at the intersection of sports and politics in the Gulf states. And we'll be doing a workshop with the Gulf Research Meeting in July in Cambridge, where we're pulling together a number of scholars to think about this area. So this is an area that we're definitely going to be doing a lot of research, whether it be really understanding what the initiatives are the Gulf states are doing in culture and entertainment and sports, and how that's affecting both the shift in the societies inside their economic positioning and their outreach and the means that they're dealing with other countries. The rise of Saudi Arabia is also, for our second point, affecting Gulf ties. So as we look at all of these countries that are now competing in these same areas, I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to both competition and cooperation in the Gulf space amongst Gulf countries. There, we do see a lot more sort of geopolitical competition in areas like the Red Sea, but there's also a lot more room for greater coordination with the end, of course, of the Gulf crisis through the Al-Ula agreement, and a lot of new initiatives, both for more openings with tourism, with allowing people to pass amongst the countries, and new transport too. So that's another area that we'll be looking at in AGSIW, as well as a number of the new relations that are built, or geopolitical bodies that are trying to pull together the interests of these Gulf states. So of course we could talk about the BRICS, where we have a kind of alternative gathering for Gulf states to pursue their economic and perhaps strategic interests, as well as a number of mini-laterals. And here I would include like the I2U2 and the IMEC, which is a new initiative that's really looking at, again, the Gulf interests and this transport going all the way in relations from India all the way to Europe. And of course, how all this is going to be impacted by this conflict happening in the region. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to let my colleagues work further on that on the economic front.
Great, thank you, Kristen. We'll move on to Robert Mogilnicki, who looks at a lot of these issues from his angle, the political economy angle. So, Robert, please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Raymond. Hello to everyone, and also thanks to Hussein and Kristen for kicking things off. What I'm going to try to do is put forth 3 points that, to my mind, are a good mix of areas that our audience should watch in the coming year, and also research focus areas of mine for 2024. The first point is has to do with China-Gulf relations. Now, I hope most of the people on this call know that I've created a China-Gulf initiative here at AGSIW, and I encourage you, if you're not familiar with that, to take a look. We've done some great work over the past year, and we're really looking to expand research and scholarly activities in that domain. I think it's important, not least because at the outset of this year, we saw a number of Gulf countries and Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia as well, joining the BRICS club. For a number of years, we saw a deeper engagement with the BRICS lender, the New Development Bank, and also engagement with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, that's just engagement on a multilateral organizational level. Really, the interesting dynamics with China-Gulf relations are going on a bilateral level, and that's where a lot of our scholarly work looks at, both my work and the contributors that we bring in for programs and publications. And I think the political economy dimension is really a great place to start for understanding China-Gulf relations, because the economic dimension of ties is really the bedrock of ties. And if you want to understand where relations are moving in terms of from oil to non-oil, or from economic to various non-economic realms, diplomatic, military, otherwise strategic forms of engagement, you really have to start with economics, with energy ties, with trade and investment. And that's a lot of what we do here. The second point has to do with Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund dynamics. There was a great report out by Global Sovereign Wealth Funds that at the end of last year that indicated the public investment fund spent nearly a quarter of total global sovereign wealth fund investments. So the PIF was a big spender last year. It's no surprise there for many of us following the PIF and its ambitions, but it's impressive nonetheless. We also know in neighboring Abu Dhabi, there is a tremendous amount of sovereign wealth. It's a big sovereign wealth fund sector. Actually, a number of sovereign wealth funds have more sovereign wealth in Abu Dhabi than the PIF. And just at the end of last year, Dubai's ruler introduced a new law announcing a new sovereign wealth fund in Dubai that, from estimates I've seen, will oversee between $80 billion and $100 billion of assets under management. This is going to make a big splash in the regional sovereign wealth fund ecosystem. And I think beyond national oil companies in the Gulf, it's really hard to pinpoint one specific entity that is more consequential for domestic, regional, and international political economy than sovereign wealth funds, especially over the past couple of years. So this will be another key area for both the audience to watch, but something that I'll be focusing on in depth here at the Institute. The third and final point has to do with situating economic development trends within a broader macroeconomic picture. And there will be a close focus on the largest economy in the region, Saudi Arabia. I, in particular, am interested in NEOM. I think it's a good bellwether for some of the most ambitious elements of the broader Vision 2030 economic transformation project going on in Saudi Arabia. I say project, I think experiment is also an appropriate word here. Just in the past month or two, in December and November of last year, there have been several new tourism and entertainment-related destinations, sub-projects, initiatives, call them what you want. They're really destinations within destinations announced. In addition to new companies within NEOM, NEOM Sports Club, there's just a tremendous amount going on, a developmental explosion. But this also comes at a time when we started to hear Saudi officials say that some project timelines are going to need to be reassessed. As I think my colleague will discuss in just a minute, there are a number of economic headwinds that Gulf policy planners and economic development officials need to keep in mind. Probably going to see some deficits coming into play this year in a number of different countries. Oil prices are certainly a concern in the region. So there's also a lot of room for us to take a hard and a real kind of honest look at what parts of this developmental experiment in places like NEOM, but also in other major initiatives in the rest of Saudi Arabia and across the broader Gulf region, what developmental initiatives are likely to move forward and advance, and what are likely to probably be reconfigured or reassessed. So I'll leave it there and let my colleague Tim take over.
Great, thanks, Robert. And this is a great place to bring in Tim Callan, visiting fellow at the AGSIW, who focuses much of his work on the Saudi economy. So Tim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raymond. Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. So let me start by focusing a little bit on the oil market, where I think it's going to be very interesting this year. And some of the work I did last year showed there has been progress with economic diversification in Saudi, but it's still heavily reliant on oil revenues. So what happens in the global oil market this year is going to be very important in terms of providing funding, both for the central government and I think also for the PIF to pursue the ambitious growth projects that they have. But at this stage, the direction of the oil market, I think, is very difficult to call. We've clearly seen very, very strong output coming out of the US over the past year or so. And this is creating, I think, a dilemma for Saudi in terms of whether they continue to limit or even have to cut production further, or whether they begin to see and allow some impact on prices, particularly if OPEC Plus members continue to ignore quotas that have been set. So if there's a drop in production or in oil prices, oil revenues go down, that's certainly going to have, I think, a big impact on the ability to push forward at the rate they want to go on some of these projects. But on the other hand, an escalation in the conflicts and tensions in the region that previous speakers have been discussing, or stronger global growth, could quickly turn the oil market, I think, in the other direction. And then clearly the scope for funding projects will continue apace. On the non-oil side, and I think, again, it's sort of easy to focus on the big statistics like, growth, inflation, fiscal and external balances. But I think four things may be of particular interest this year, which I will try and look at in some of my work. And the first is on the female labour force participation rate. We saw rapid increase in the number of Saudi women participating in the labour market from about late 2017 through end 2021. But that's sort of flatlined since late 2021. And the rates, stayed broadly in the range of 35 to 36%. I think there's still considerable scope for this to go higher, the participation rate over time. So I'm going to be looking, I think, with interest to see whether we see a renewed upward movement in the participation rate this year. And if not, then trying to understand whether, maybe we've reached a plateau or what could be holding further gains back. Second, has already been mentioned a couple of times, but the tourism sector. Vision 2030 places a lot of emphasis on developing the tourism sector, and it seems to be working. Foreign and domestic tourism is booming, and I expect strong growth to continue unless there's a much deeper broadening of the conflict in the region. To give a sense of the scale of the change here, if you go back a decade, the travel balance in the current account was in a deficit of about $10 billion US. Probably last year and this year is actually in a surplus of about $10 billion US. So that's a big change. So it means rather than Saudi residents spending more overseas on travel and tourism than non-residents are spending in Saudi, it's now the other way around. Non-residents are spending more in Saudi than Saudis are spending overseas. Third, foreign direct investment. Clearly, this is one of the big targets of Vision 2030 to bring more FDI into the country. It's really important in terms of bringing the skills and technology that Saudi wants in higher tech areas into the economy. I think the recently released data using revised methodologies shows some pickup in the FDI flows if you exclude oil and gas deals in the last few years. But it's certainly nowhere near the levels that have been hoped for. So I think keeping an eye on this year and into the medium term will be really important to see whether we're getting more investment that's needed into the economy. And then lastly is educational achievement. Strengthening the education system in Saudi is essential for equipping young Saudis with the skills needed for the dynamic non-oil economy that's trying to be created. At the end of this year, the 2023 edition of the Trends in International Mathematics and Science study will be published. And this is sort of like standardized international tests on maths and science. Saudi Arabia, in past years has scored very poorly, along with most other Gulf countries in these standardized tests. On the other hand, of course, many of the Asian countries score very highly, unsurprisingly. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether we can spot any improvements in these standardized scores when the new study comes out at the end of this year, to see whether the education reforms in the kingdom are beginning to pay any dividends in terms of the potential for skill development going forward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I'll move on to our colleague, Eleanor Vindenbosch, who actually was at COP28 in Abu Dhabi in November, December, and has some takeaways to share with us, in addition to kind of a broader outlook of the political economy of climate change and climate technology, which was on display also during COP. So Eleanor, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. This year, my focus will be on the implications of COP28 in domestic politics of the Gulf. The framework, of course, is AGSIW's climate initiative, where you can find plenty of in-depth research on energy transition. So the document that came out of COP28 mentioned several important things. The first one being transitioning away from oil, from fossil fuels, and transforming energy systems, which of course was there was a lot of talks in the media about this because for activists it wasn't enough. But I think for oil-dependent countries, it was a big step that they took. They also mentioned tripling the investments in renewable energy. And overall, I think that document was a critical signal about how we need to transition. There was also the aspect of the global stocktake, which is kind of a scorecard to track progress in different countries. And during COP28, the Gulf countries, and specifically the UAE, we worked really hard to showcase the technology that they are investing in and seeking contracts with international companies or companies from the EU or the US to advance climate technology. I think the big shift that I would like to work on is that they now see the huge economic potential of climate technology. And so, for example, there was a lot of many panels and a lot of talk about CCS technology and also how to clean up oil production to be able to produce oil for a longer period of time without the side effects. So whether that's feasible remains to be seen, but it's a step, at least in the right direction. And this leads to kind of the political economy of climate change in the Gulf, which is going to look very different in the various countries of the Gulf. But one common aspect would be safety and security, security in terms of food security and water security, and also addressing vulnerability to extreme events, extreme weather events, which they are not very well prepared for at this point. Another aspect will be, of course, the goal of rent replacement to maintain the social contract upon which Gulf states were founded, while reducing the damaging effects of oil production to the environment. And there are two aspects specifically in this idea of rent replacement is the carbon trading business, which the UAE is really investing a lot in, and also green hydrogen, which AGSIW is going to have a panel on in the next few weeks.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. I failed to mention initially that we are open for questions, so please type in your questions in the Q&A function. Don't hold back. Don't wait until the last portion. Since we are a small group also, we will allow questions in person via your microphone, via the audio. So you can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, but we'll save that the in-person questions towards the latter end of the program. But in the meantime, please feel free to type in your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom here. With that, we'll take things across the Gulf to look at Iran with our Iran specialist, Ali Alfone, a senior fellow at AGSIW. Ali, if you can hear me, we don't see you on the screen. We'd like to bring you into the conversation. Okay. How about we turn to AGSIW President Ambassador Douglas Silliman, who is looking at some key issues kind of on the geopolitical angle, looking at Iraq with Iran proxies operating there, and as well as increased Houthi attacks coming out of Yemen. So Doug, the floor is yours, and we'll go back to Ali right after that.
Raymond, thank you very much, and Happy New Year to everybody online with us. I'm going to pick up on a couple of the themes that Hussein Ibish mentioned at the beginning, and I'm sure that Ali Alfone will mention when he gets back on. I want to look at the fallout from the war in Gaza on the periphery of the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf, particularly the actions of Iranian proxy forces in Iraq and in Yemen. which, as Hussein mentioned, are going to pose a significant policy challenge to the Biden administration going forward. I'll start first in Iraq, where since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, Iranian-supported militias, some of whom are actually part of the formal Iraqi state security structure, have conducted far more than 100 attacks against U.S. troops inside Iraq, and a handful of American responses in retaliation have killed several militia members inside Iraq, including a couple of senior commanders of one formal militia that is also part of the security structure, sparking again a renewal of calls for the immediate departure of all U.S. and foreign forces from Iraq. Prime Minister Soudani has adopted this call and has said that he will be forming with the United States a commission to discuss how that's going to happen quickly. The Pentagon, interestingly, yesterday said that they were unaware of any plans to withdraw from Iraq and have not received any communications from the Iraqi government on this topic. So there's a lot more that will happen in that case. And frankly, the departure of U.S. forces could make more complicated U.S. counterterrorism operations in both Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere in the region. And we can talk more about that if you're interested. In Yemen, Ansar Allah, the Houthis have begun attacking shipping that they believe or say is in some way tied to Israel. These attacks have caused a number of global shipping companies to go not through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal, but to sail all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, expanding the transit time and potentially threatening to disrupt global supply chains, which were just coming out of the difficulties they had during the period of COVID. The United States has formed a relatively modest naval task force, but has yet to take any actions against the source of the Houthi attacks. And yesterday, again, interestingly, the Houthis announced that shipping does not need to worry about Houthi attacks. All that ships must do as they cross into the Bab el-Mandeb is to declare by radio that they have no connection whatsoever to Israel and they will be permitted to pass with no harassment. This is obviously unacceptable both for the U.S. Navy and for international shipping. So again, you have a showdown here that could have some significant implications. The implications of all this could be on international counterterrorism missions in the Middle East, on global supply chains, and should the Houthis or Iran decide that they want to slow down or affect the oil markets, if some of the maritime security issues move to the Gulf, or begin to impact the shipment of hydrocarbons, then you could see an impact on the price of oil and gas globally. Raymond, I'll give it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Doug. And Ali is with us now, so I'll turn things over to Ali to tell us more about what he's working on and the role of Iran in the region nowadays.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation and for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis video. And I do apologize for the technical issues. In 2024, I will be focusing on two main issues. Within Iran, there is an issue of the succession after Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, the debate is out in the open. There will be election to the Assembly of Experts in March. And already we are seeing how the regime is manipulating the election and the candidates so that only individuals who will be pointing at the right individual to succeed Mr. Khamenei will be elected into office. I have a book on the subject published most kindly by the AGSIW, and I will be working more on this subject. With regard to the Middle East region and Iran's Arab neighbors, most unfortunately, what we are witnessing right now in Gaza is manifestation of the strategic rivalry between Iran and Israel. Now, this rivalry is most likely going to continue for some time until Iran reaches strategic parity with Israel. And Israel obviously has no interest in Iran reaching strategic parity with the Jewish state. So this struggle will continue for some time. Israel will try to prevent Iran becoming a nuclear power, and Iran will retaliate in indirect ways through proxies, and that is the preferred method of Iran to deal with Israel and other adversaries. And this is the fight that the Arab states are absolutely not interested in. They have indicated this to the United States, to Iran, and to Israel. However, unfortunately, they may become entangled in it, especially if there is escalation of the tension and the conflict between Iran and Israel. If the United States, contrary to our expectations, gets entangled in another regional war before the presidential election in the US, and in that case, Arab states may also become targets, victims in a fight in which they have absolutely no interest in. So these are the subjects that I've been working on in 2024.
Thank you so much, Ali. We'd like to turn now to Ambassador Bill Roebuck, who promised not to let us forget about any other areas of potential conflict around the periphery of the region. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raymond. There's a lot to digest in what the scholars and Doug and others have said about all the issues. I'm going to raise one issue to sort of bring the discussion to a close today. There's been a dominant narrative in Gulf policy over the past several years of extrication from conflict. Our colleague Hussein Ibish has written and spoken about it very eloquently in various junctures. I think it is an accurate descriptor of a dynamic, but the dynamic is complicated. There has been a lot of extrication from conflict in the region and a reliance instead on diplomacy, soft power, and commerce to attain national interests and the pursuit of interests that these Gulf countries want to address. But conflict in what I would call the slice periphery countries, and when I say slice periphery, I mean Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Sudan. Those conflicts remain active at various stages, and Gulf countries have been involved actively in some of them earlier on, and there remains some degree of involvement in these countries and in the conflicts in these countries going forward. Now, these conflicts are at various stages. In Syria, you have a messy, essentially post-war conflict that could re-erupt. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got a conflict that's hot, but has just really emerged in the last 7 to 9 months in the Sudan. And in the middle, you've got Libya, a relatively dormant conflict that could also re-erupt, and that is feeding the conflict in Sudan. The Yemen conflict, which Doug talked about a bit in his remarks, remains a focus of extrication. It's a place where the Saudis for over a year have struggled to get out, to extricate themselves from that conflict. And those extrication efforts will continue and will define their efforts in regional foreign policy in a key way in the year going forward. The Emiratis, of course, have already established an extrication narrative. They are out of Yemen, and yet in some ways, as we know, they are still very much involved in Yemen. So the extrication narrative on Yemen will be very important. The final thing I would mention on this extrication narrative, and it's been covered in depth by Hussein, I'll just mention the Gaza conflict. And it's the point that the conflicts that you expect are not always the conflicts that you get. A year ago, no one expected a Palestinian hot military conflict to emerge, and yet it has, and it has disrupted all sorts of regional perspectives. The final point I would make is that we will be covering these types of conflicts on the periphery of the Gulf, and it depends on where they are. Our coverage will be event driven. It will focus on the interests that the countries in the Gulf are pursuing and the various ways that these pursuits of interests and influence will affect their relations with the United States, for example. I'll stop there, Raymond. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. We already have a couple of questions that we'll turn to in a moment. But I'd also like to mention that we do have a couple of our non-resident fellows with us on the call. namely Kate Durian, who focuses on energy and the energy transition, and Aisha Sarahi, who's one of the top Gulf experts on climate and energy transition as well. So Kate and Aisha, if you have anything to add to this, if you feel like we missed anything, please raise your hand and we can open the microphone for you. But if not, we can move forward to our Q&A. And we have a couple of questions directed to Hussein specifically. Hussein, you did mention the Qatar's policy regarding Hamas. Can you please elaborate further on that?
Okay.
You also mentioned the focus on normalization that the U.S. was focused on. Do you expect a return to that once the conflict in Gaza abates, or what is the day after for Gaza look like?
Great questions, both really great questions. I deal with the Qatar issue in an article in the Atlantic, which came out about 10 minutes ago. So, but look, here's the thing about Qatar. Qatar, unlike the other Gulf states, has a long history of supporting Islamists, especially Brotherhood-related parties, and that includes Hamas. Now, until October 7, this was okay because Qatar was seen as kind of a stabilizing force. It was paying the bills in Gaza, keeping food on the table, and the Hamas leaders that had left Gaza and gone to Damascus and then had to flee Syria because of the Muslim Brotherhood role in the uprising against Bashar al-Assad that began in 2011, were seen as sort of, stabilizing figures, relatively okay, people you could talk to, much like the Taliban figures that were also in Doha without being sponsored by Qatar, but still. Now, the question for Qatar is, number one, is Israel going to go on an assassination campaign? Saleh al-Aruri was killed in Beirut, but he was a unique figure in the sense that he's not sort of part of the de facto, what the Politburo leaders in Doha have become is the diplomatic wing of Hamas. They're not the leaders in Doha. The leaders are in Gaza on the ground, the military wing, and militant politicians like Yahya Sinwar. They make the decisions for Hamas. So these guys in Qatar have become the diplomats of Hamas. Saleh al-Aruri was a different guy because he was the point person in bridging between the leadership in Doha, the now diplomats in Doha, and the Qassam brigades on the ground. He was crucial in liaising with Turkey, where he lived, and the other place he lived was Beirut, where he was crucial in liaising with Hezbollah and Iran, and he was a major figure in the war room that they established in Beirut. And so he may be a unique figure. So it could be that Qatar is not going to be the scene of many Israeli assassinations, but if Israel is sincere about killing all these figures, they're going to have to either start killing people in Qatar, which will be a major crisis, or Qatar is going to be pressured to back down finally, after decades of pressure, to start amending its policies towards radical Islamist groups like Hamas and show these people the door so they don't get killed in Qatar. So that's sort of where Qatar comes in. There is the possibility, of course, that Qatar could become the de facto international fiduciary for Gaza, taking the lead in organizing post-conflict stabilization through these leaders who could emerge once again as a power center in Hamas if the military leaders in Gaza are killed or captured. Then if Qatar takes the lead in funding stabilization and reconstruction in Gaza through these people, they could come back to the political leadership of Hamas. But that would require the Israelis to sort of get over the trauma that they're experiencing. I really think Israel's policies since October 7 have to be viewed through the prism of trauma and collective hysteria, because a lot of what they're doing is not explicable otherwise. And it's understandable given what happened. All right, so the other question, Raymond, what was the other question?
The other question was more about the day after.
Oh, the day after, yeah.
Exactly. U.S. policy, do you see a return to
Yes.
moves
Yes.
towards normalization? And in general, what is the
So
day
this
after?
is what I was talking about when I said in this crisis, this total collapse of U.S. policy, there is the potential for a major success. If the U.S. can manage the containment of the conflict, and so far it has, right? So far it has. The Houthis are really a problem that has to be dealt with, but it's not completely out of control. Shipping is returning to the Red Sea. This coalition does not include any of the Red Sea littoral states, but it probably does in reality. So countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia are not formally members of the anti-Houthi piracy coalition, but in effect, I would think that they are, possibly even Israel as well. So it may be a more serious force than we think. And also, I do think the U.S. may be very serious about getting this under control. If the U.S. can restrain Israel, find some sort of formula with Hezbollah, or just simply tell the Israelis that if they attack Hezbollah unnecessarily at the moment, under whatever pretext they use, whether it's the danger to Israeli civilians, or enforcing Security Council Resolution 1701, or whatever they come up with, if they attack Hezbollah when Hezbollah is not interested in a war with Israel, then the United States, then Israel is on its own. And the U.S. is not going to come to their aid. It's going to have to come to that, I think. And I believe the Biden administration is actually capable of saying that, given the bear hug of support over Gaza, and sort of say to the Israelis, look, when you're engaged in a legitimate war of defense, we support you 100%. But if you're going to go on some madcap, unnecessary adventure that is highly destabilizing, we're not with you. And you can't rely on us, not just for munitions, but also for all kinds of support. It may come to that, and that would be a very sobering thing for the Israelis to hear. If all of this can be contained through U.S. leadership, then I think the possibility is not just that the U.S. will regain credibility, right, but also that it can, especially if Biden is reelected in November, which I personally think is very likely, then if the conflict is contained, relative calm is restored, and understanding that there's nothing much you can do about Iran's nuclear program, but still, you can restore a sense of relative calm. Then I do think the administration could get back to negotiations for the triangular deal. It's still in the interest of all three countries. The key to everything may be a less extreme Israel. And the problem with that is a traumatized Israel may not be ready to be a more reasonable Israel. And it's, as I mentioned in my remarks, it's not just enemies of the United States that are posing dire problems for the realization of U.S. policy, the good U.S. policy that pre-October 7. It's also Israel itself, because its extremism is a problem both in wartime and in peace. So that's basically what I would say.
Great, thank you, Hussein. I think a couple of people can pick up on the next question, so I'll just throw it out there. And it's focused on Saudi Arabia and Iran. And if I can read it here, although KSA has normalized relations with Iran, does the historic KSA-Iran rivalry still have any bearing on the current tensions in the region? Hussein, if you want to pick that up, and then we can bring in Ali and others as well to
Well, without a doubt, it does. But I think it's fascinating that the Saudis have been trying to work in concert with Iran during this conflict, that they have met and had a kind of, according to the Iranians, a kind of joint session of the OIC in Jeddah, but actually it was, I think, really a Saudi thing, but they didn't object to the Iranians claiming some role there. And, I think as long as the U.S. has not provided the security guarantees that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are looking for, that would have been part of the triangular deal. And even if they did do that, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have really changed their policies to ones that seek regional stabilization as a basis for success. And that means trying to avoid confrontation with Iran, even if Iran uses its proxy network to, create havoc in the region. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd ask Ali to chime in, and anybody else.
Great. Ali, would you like to pick up on that? Or if anyone else would like to, please, the floor is yours.
Well, Raymond, let me throw something in. I want to go back to something that Kristen said earlier, is that the policies of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, are now based on a stable relationship with Iran. The goals of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, even in the Gaza crisis, have not significantly changed. They're looking at economic development, internal development of their populations, of their economies, climate change adaptation, and stability of the Gulf region is important for the success of these policies. So I think that certainly Saudi Arabia will want to continue on a more peaceful or non-confrontational path with Iran. The question in my mind, as I mentioned briefly in my presentation, is whether or not at some point Iran will see an advantage in messing with oil markets or using the Houthis to mess with oil markets, not just commercial shipping through the Suez Canal as a potential flashpoint.
To answer your question, I do believe, yes, that is correct. And what I also find particularly interesting is how much praise Saudi Arabia has received within Iran, where analysts are wondering how Saudis have managed to somewhat, normalize diplomatic relations with Iran and make overtures towards Israel. They think it is something that Iran should learn from, because it is, actually something that has benefited Saudi Arabia, has placed Saudi Arabia in a very good position vis-a-vis the US. So that is something that I find very interesting, and something that Iranian analysts find very interesting. The other part is the Houthis, which Fars News Agency, which is a mouthpiece of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, their explanation of why we are seeing these maritime attacks is that this is actually nothing to do with the war in Gaza. This is retaliation against Israeli attacks and sabotage against Iranian shipping. Now, I'm sure that different parties have different interests, and there is a reason why they are making such public statements on their website. But this is also something that we need to take into consideration, that the Israel-Iran rivalry is playing out in many different fields, including the maritime fields.
So that's what I meant, by the way, when I said that the Houthi attacks are part of an effort by Iran to say that if it's not included in maritime security regimes in the Gulf and the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea, then there won't be one. And they will disrupt them. So I totally agree with Ali on that.
Before we turn on to a question from Ambassador Deborah Jones, Ali, maybe I can get you to comment on the recent attack in Iran on a commemoration of the death of
Qasim Soleimani.
So if you can please comment on that one and any repercussions that you see coming out of it.
It is quite interesting that Iran is pointing a finger not at the United States, not against Israel, but is specifically talking and discussing Islamist radicalism in Central Asia, specifically Tajikistan and Afghanistan to a certain extent, where they believe that radicals from Central Asia have free hands to operate against Iran. And that is something which is really upsetting Tehran's strategy toward the Taliban. They really try to improve relations with the Taliban, particularly, under the US occupation of Afghanistan and even after that. But there are factions within Taliban who simply do not want to cooperate with Iran. And perhaps they are providing material aid to radical groups coming from Central Asia, Tajikistan. So the really interesting thing is, for one sake, the officialdom of the Islamic Republic is not accusing the usual suspects, in their view, the United States, Israel, and, to some extent, Saudi Arabia. They are not.
So there is a subtext with some people that the U.S. is, created ISIS and is responsible, but you're right. The regime is not pushing that right now.
Great. If we can turn on now to the question from Ambassador Deborah Jones, who I think has been partially answered, but Hussein, it's directed to you to elaborate on UAE interests in the Red Sea, Horn of Africa, in the context of the extrication conversation.
Yeah, I mean, no,
Ambassador Buck mentioned that as well. So if you would like to add to that.
I think we should both take this out. Look, it's crucial. It's crucial to the UAE. UAE is is very focused on maritime commerce, right? For itself, and as a broker, as a manager of ports, as a maritime commercial center, right? And so anyone who is disrupting shipping in the Gulf, in the Arabian Sea, or in the Red Sea is messing with the UAE, even though the UAE is far away. It's not a Red Sea littoral state, but still it is part of an unofficial part of that coalition. I said the littoral states, most of them were unofficial partners. I would add the UAE in that, by the way, because UAE interest in commerce in the Red Sea is so strong. There's a real presence of the UAE in that region, and for the UAE, disruption of maritime commerce is disastrous. So this Houthi piracy cuts to the core of the UAE's commercial interests, and also its broader need for stability and security. These countries, UAE and Saudi Arabia, came to dislike the decade of conflict and confrontation kicked off by the Arab Spring very much. They found that it did not advantage them. It was not good for them. And they've turned away from it in a kind of disgust. And so any hint of a return to conflict and confrontation is extremely alarming, including to the UAE as far away as the Red Sea.
Thank you. Bill, would you like to add to that?
I'd make two quick points. One is, I agree with what Hussein said, but I also think that despite the interest that the UAE has, the maritime interest in the Red Sea and further beyond, I don't think it has the capability to exert much influence there on that. I think it's going to have to depend on the United States maybe, or the coalition that the United States has put together. The other point I would make is that in Yemen, interestingly, and in Sudan, countries that sort of are across the Red Sea from each other, the Saudis and the Emiratis have moved into a situation where they're backing opposite forces in these conflicts, and these are not hot, areas of conflict between them right now, but it does point to a sort of regional competition for influence, I think, that bears watching in the future.
Thank you. Kristen, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that as well. Just to the direct question that Deborah asked, I think, about the question of the UAE is extricating itself from the Red Sea. That's certainly not the case, and I think that was implied in what the ambassador just said. UAE is very involved, both through its shipping and its commercial interests in the Red Sea, but because of those interests is really involving itself in a number of different conflicts in the region as well. And I think it's important when we look at the UAE to analyze it. It's repeatedly kind of referred to itself now, the UAE, as this network power, but also as an Arabian Peninsular power. And I think the UAE really sees itself reaching out both in the east towards India, other partners out that way, and towards the west, towards the Red Sea, and East African partners as really key to its overall broader development and expansion of its interests. And I think that also speaks to areas of where it is now sort of a conflict with Saudi Arabia, or at least there's some tension where they do stand on opposite sides in some of these different conflicts. And And it's interesting to see how the Red Sea is going to be developing, especially when we look at Saudi Arabia and when you look at the mega projects that they're developing, whether that be the new tourism projects on the Red Sea or NEOM itself, as Robert spoke to earlier, the majority of them are really on the Red Sea coast. And so we really see the shift in the Saudi economy from the sort of, you could call it a more Islamic-centered and oil-centered, or rather oil-centered economy that used to be on the east, to a shift towards the west. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because it means that Saudi Arabia will be its own sort of independent power with its own interests, which we can see through its cultivation of its own partnership of the Red Sea. I forgot what they've termed it, actually, the Red Sea alliance that they have there. So that's definitely something in the future to watch, is both through the conflicts that are happening there with the Houthis, but also these other Gulf powers that have their own separate and sometimes conflicting interests there.
Thank you, Kristen. We don't have any more questions, so perhaps, Kristen, since we have you on with the microphone, you focus quite a bit of your work on generational change within ruling families. It's something that we talk about all the time. We didn't mention it at length in this conversation. We did just have a transition in Kuwait with the ascension of new Emir Mashal. So if I can get you to comment a little bit on that and what you foresee for Kuwait this year, and then if there are any kind of areas of generational change that you're looking at too in different Gulf countries.
Yeah, no, thank you, Raymond. And that, from the origins of the founding of AGSIW way back in 2015, the whole issue of generational change and kind of youth perspectives has been something that we've really tried to foreground in our work. We still maintain a blog called Millennial Gulf, where we look at youth aspirations and initiatives, and those could be either in kind of the social sphere, even political activists, but also very much now these days in arts and technology and other areas and entrepreneurship. So I hope that you all will look to that, because we now have many, many years of interviews and analysis of trends that really, I think, show the voice not only of youth in the region, but really in this generational perspective, I think a whole now warehouse of information about trends and predictions of where the Gulf states themselves want to see themselves going. So I really hope you'll look to that. The generational change has not only happened amongst the population, but also amongst the leadership, as Raymond just said. It's been really fascinating, I think, to track both the shifting ambitions of these states as they have gone through these generational changes, but also sometimes the tensions within the ruling families. And I have been following one trend, which has been definitely when we look at that transition and really oftentimes this move to a next generation, there has been a tendency to centralize power within these states within one ruling line. We've seen a real push of leaders and rulers and emirs and kings to appoint their own sons. And this was not necessarily the case in the generation previous to that, or not the generation, but in earlier transitions. So in Kuwait, it's very interesting to see, because Kuwait is that one country that had been absent from that trend. Kuwait had held to the older tradition of really looking to elders within the family and having that as a norm, and just the way that the ruling family was kind of working out through that. We have seen a succession of quite elder leaders, both through the death of Sabah al-Ahmed, now to his brother Nawaf al-Ahmed, who has now also passed away, and passed to his half-brother, Mishal Ahmed. In all the cases, then these were men in their 80s. So I think it will be very interesting to see who Mishal decides to appoint as his crown prince. In the early stages, it looks like there's been perhaps, and it's not quite clear yet, but a shift away from both of the generational contenders for that had spent basically a decade kind of fighting over this claim to leadership. One, Nasser al-Mohammed al-Sabah, who had been once the ambassador to Iran and once a longstanding prime minister as well. And Ahmed al-Fahad, who has recently returned to the scene, most recently as Minister of Defense. There seems to be a desire to maybe move away from both of these, as well as from what had once been seen as another future leader, which is the son of Nawaf al-Ahmad, which is Ahmed al-Nawaf, the past prime minister. We saw when Michel came to power, he specifically rebuked Ahmed Nawaf and his leadership and his dealings with the parliament in particular. So we may see him wanting to move in a completely different direction. And the first hint of that was the return of Mohammed Sabah Salam as prime minister, who's now been appointed. And I suspect Michel may also be looking towards his own son to play a more prominent role. Right now, Ahmed Michel has a position that is important in overseeing sort of good governance and oversight over government. And that's going to be an area where Michel is really going to be focusing. So I don't know if he will have the ability to appoint him as crown prince right away, but I think putting him in a more prominent position and maybe in a position to move in that direction is probably something that I would expect to be watching for.
Yeah. Raymond, may I add something to the conversation for a minute? We've talked a lot about the Houthi threat, but what we haven't mentioned is the impact of the rise of the Houthi threat on Saudi perceptions of of American perceptions of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. Okay, this war has been the source of one of the main sources of tension, and it's been based on a narrative that this was a crazy madcap piece of Saudi adventurism for no good reason, and that the Houthis were not a threat, and the Houthis are a Yemeni problem, and the Saudis have just gone mad, and they've gotten into a crazy quagmire, and they went nuts. I think that narrative is dead in Washington. I mean, even Chris Shays is not going to be able to say it, because the Saudi contention that the Houthis are dangerous fanatics and really a problem well beyond Yemen, and something that needed to be dealt with one way or another, has been, I think, seriously vindicated. That doesn't mean the U.S. policy of wanting to get Saudi Arabia out of Yemen is going to change. And the Saudis want to get out of Yemen too. But I think that the role of the Yemen war as a major irritant between Saudi Arabia and the United States is probably gone, because the Saudi narrative has been vindicated really strongly in Washington for anyone who gives a damn about global interests and security. And so I think that's a remarkable development, right? If you had said to me a few months ago that Washington would be forced to change its mind entirely about the nature of the Saudi war in Yemen and become a lot more sympathetic to the whole project than it had been, I would have laughed. But that is, in fact, what is happening.
Great, thank you, Hussein. I just want to go back to previous conversation and ask Kristen to say a little bit more about Oman and the leadership transition that is solidifying now in Oman. And perhaps, Robert, am I anticipating your comments here to have you comment on economic changes, recent economic developments in Oman, and how that picture is looking?
I'll just be really brief and just express something to the direct question. I think that came from Ambassador Jones about the role of these peripheral countries. Well, peripheral. I'm calling them peripheral, which anticipates, I think, my argument, which is that I think as we've seen Saudi Arabia really come to the fore and be much more ambitious in its policies and its transformation, alongside the UAE also being a much more powerful sort of middle power with strong ties to a number of important countries, we have seen a decline, I would say, in the influence of these once kind of mediating countries of Oman and Kuwait. I think that's due in part to their own, well, one, just to the fact for Oman that it sort of does have, in a way, less influence in its avenue of influence before, in an arena where the U.S. was seeking peace with Iran, way back in the Obama administration. is sort of been superseded. Maybe that could come back, but I think even if it does come back, probably Oman wouldn't be the chief mediator, and may not be interested in that mediation. And Kuwait really has been quite looking internal, both towards within the ruling family of trying to set its own house in order, and of its own sort of domestic disputes about the direction that Kuwait wants to take. So I think besides Kuwait standing out on key issues, notably, in fact, the issue of Gaza, where they've been very, very forceful and strong advocates for the Palestinian position in a way that I think we haven't even seen fully in the other Gulf states, full-throated, I guess, advocates, that those countries really don't have as much forceful influence on the regional policies. So I'll just leave that there and let Robert speak to some of the more.
Can I just say Qatar has been
Robert
very
wanted to say something.
full-throated. Yeah.
Sorry, Robert.
No problem. Yeah, just two points on the economics with respect to Kuwait and Oman. I think the first, back to my point about following sovereign wealth funds, given the political transition in Kuwait, we may want to keep a closer eye on whether and how Kuwaiti sovereign wealth will be utilized over the coming year. Especially if we keep in mind how the Saudis and the Emiratis have very effectively leveraged their sovereign wealth, in particular to advance domestic development initiatives and agendas. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Kuwaitis and different officials overseeing the sovereign wealth fund, the KIA, to do something similar, not on a in a comprehensive way, but to spin off some of that sovereign wealth, create a smaller fund dedicated to domestic development. Last year, there were some rumors and the hints that various officials were considering such a move. And I think given the developments that have happened in the region's sovereign wealth fund sector and some of the successes that the Saudis and the Emiratis have been able to garner in that respect, will increase the pressure and some of the push factors behind such a move. That's on Kuwait. And then on Oman, I wrote a piece last year that said Oman is getting economic policy making right. If I wanted to be lazy and irritate our Mary, our editor, I would just repost that again. Oman is getting economic policy making right. It's on track based on preliminary estimates to run a surplus again this year. It'd be a second consecutive year, demonstrating that a country, even with relatively limited means, if they go about policy making in a feasible way, identify a modest amount of priority areas to make progress on, they can demonstrate a certain degree of progress on fiscal consolidation. The Omanis are doing that. The big problem is they are in a neighborhood with much bigger economies, faster moving economies that are generating a lot of the attention and sucking essentially sucking a lot of the attention out of the room. So they're going to have a hard time competing on the level of the Saudis and the Emiratis, just because they're on such a different order of magnitude for their economy. But I suspect we will be able to see a number of ways in which the Omanis are looking for ways to find niche areas to develop in their economies that complement the broader processes of economic diversification and development that are going on in the region. So that's it. 2 points on Kuwait and Oman.
Thank you so much, Robert. Before we close out, let's tackle this one last question directed to Eleanor. And if I can summarize it, where does Saudi Arabia really stand on climate change response and preparedness, given kind of its positioning at COP28?
Yes, this is a great question that I've been also trying to think about for a while, because I think the reason that they're investing so much in green projects without wanting to put it in writing at COP28 is because they don't want external constraints on their actions, right? So I think they want to set their own agenda. What I found very interesting is that the last Arab Barometer had a series of questions, and it's not in Saudi Arabia, but in other Gulf states, had a series of questions about climate change, asking perceived threat of climate change on private lives. And it seems that citizens of the Gulf were very worried about climate change, but also said that there was no immediate effect on their own lives, right? So I don't know if that indicates kind of a lack of communication, of official communication about climate risks in those countries, because the government wants to keep a full hand on climate policies, and certainly does not want international organizations putting pressure on them to implement specific policies. So I think that's where the discrepancy comes from.
Great, thank you. Doug, would you
also
add?
just,
Yeah.
but I think that probably Tim can speak more to this, is that for Saudi Arabia, because of climate change, the GDP, Saudi GDP is supposed to contract by 12% by 2050. And so, but I mean, Tim is the specialist on this. So, but I've read from several sources that their GDP is going to start contracting because of the effect of climate change. And I'm sure that though they don't really want the population to start panicking, the government is taking action to limit the economic effect of climate change.
Tim, anything to add to that before we turn over to Doug?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I go back that, sort of Saudi Arabia is still hugely dependent on oil, right? And anything that is seen to be, potentially diminishing future demand for oil is something that, Saudi is not going to be happy with. I mean, I think it's, eminently, the right strategy for them to be trying to develop, sort of alternate sources of energy, while they're still, selling their oil, and trying to make that last as long as possible, right? From their perspective, I don't think there's a contradiction with them, sort of developing that for domestic sources, and then also exporting oil where the demand is there. Ellen was right that if you look at studies done by the IMF and others, sort of imposition of carbon taxes on a global level is very negative for Saudi GDP over the medium term. So they're, I guess, in a sense, are arguing their interests in these international fora, and I think that'll continue.
And I think what both Eleanor and Tim said is absolutely correct. The Saudis are aware of their dependence on hydrocarbons and oil. They are also trying at the same time not only to have a rational energy transition, but they also want to try to develop an economy that is broad enough so that if you are growing entertainment and tourism in one part of the economy, you can potentially replace a lot of hydrocarbons with green hydrogen or other sort of new energy fuels. So there's a very broad strategy by the Saudis to keep the income coming in from their current hydrocarbons production, even as they try to develop new processes and new ideas to expand and keep a big chunk of their future economy focused on energy. As Robert mentioned, this is one of the things that they're trying to do at NEOM. They're trying to actually provide a setting in NEOM for a complete sort of carbon neutral cycle where all the electricity is provided in NEOM by renewable resources of one port or another, or resources that don't even cancel out with carbon credits, that are actually carbon free. It's incredibly ambitious. It may not succeed, but the Saudis want to be the first to accomplish that. They want that for national prestige. They want that for the possibility of better marketing of hydrogen and other energy that they're going to produce there. And they simply want to be seen as the leaders in this field, as they are seen as the leaders in oil right now. So I mean, there's a lot involved in here that's beyond just energy transition, domestic politics, the ideas for the future, and how Saudi Arabia is perceived, and they're trying to manage all these very difficult tasks simultaneously. It's a real difficult project.
Thank you. Kristen?
Yeah, just really briefly, that's another area to watch, because I think all my colleagues are correct that Saudi Arabia, their whole transformation is utterly dependent on oil still, and on oil prices remaining high. So the whole geopolitics of oil and how Saudi Arabia will be intervening very strongly in that to try to manage oil prices is something to watch. And the different timeline that Saudi Arabia is on relative to the Emirates, which they themselves are wanting to very much raise it. Their production is capabilities are much higher now. They're going to want to bring all of that online. Creates another area of tension between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They've been able to manage that with some conflicts within oil markets, but that'll be another thing I think really to watch that will have a bearing on these really big pictures of geopolitics of oil, as well as the U.S., as we've seen the U.S. coming online very strongly with U.S. producers actually being the main reason that oil prices have been going down, is going to be creating a lot of geopolitical tension through the oil and energy markets, even as we transition to other kinds of energy.
Okay, if there's nothing to add, thank you all for joining us. Please be on the lookout for upcoming webinars. You'll see very shortly an invitation to join an event next Wednesday, which will be an IMF report launch looking at economic prospects and policy challenges for the GCC countries. So please stay tuned for other invitations for future webinars, and visit us at www.agsiw.org for our latest blogs, videos, and other publications. So thank you for joining, and we'll see you all very soon.